All right, let me start with a riddle. What's got two thumbs and has done all three things in that trite meme from N1 Training? This guy. That's right. I'm going to talk about training and muscular failure again. Specifically, I want to address this assertion that training muscular failure causes excess fatigue. But more than that, I want to look at the nuances that I agree N1 is right, nobody ever talks about. Because nuance doesn't fit on trite memes, like it doesn't fit on theirs. When people are speaking in absolutes in 1080 by 1080p images, they have to just speak in absolutes. And a lot of what they're saying is contextually right, but globally less than right. So that's what I want to look at. So just to make these videos a little bit more reasonable in length, I'm going to divide it up into 3 parts, attempting to make the sections equal in duration and fairly self-contained. So let's get started. Oh, and I'll make sure not to use harsh language or mean words because I wouldn't want to hurt anybody's whittled feelings. Let's get started. Now, just because people seem to have difficulty understanding this, let me clarify my stance again. My putting up videos demonstrating training to muscular failure is not the same as advocating people train to muscular failure. It's just showing what it looks like, because most of y'all don't know and have never done it. Me talking about what muscular failure is or what it represents is not the same as advocating training to muscular failure. Me pointing out correctly that Mike's claims of a set to 0 reps in reserve with his trainee is not muscular failure is not the same as advocating training to muscular failure. Because throughout all of his rebuttals to me, Mike repeatedly said Lyle advocates training to failure, even though I repeatedly said I was not doing that. I have never, ever said that you must train to failure to grow, that you must train to failure to make gains. If you go back to my first book in 1988, back when Mike was still desperately losing bodybuilding contests, I said that as long as you were within 1 to 2 reps of failure, you were probably fine. If you look at my generic bulking routine that I wrote 15 years ago, said, 1 to 3 reps to failure. Now, failure may occur in a workout as a consequence of fatigue, because when you train hard, you get tired and you lose reps. But that was never the goal. I never told people to chase failure. Do you understand the difference? In recent podcasts, when I've talked about this topic, I have suggested that for intermediates and beyond, beginners is a different thing, that every 3 or 4 weeks, take the final set of an exercise to failure. And if you're more than 2 reps from your repetition goal, that it's time to add weight. But that's as a test. It is not an all the time thing. It is simply a way to see exactly where you're at. I would mention again the elite female powerlifter that I coach. She holds multiple state, national, and world records in all 3 lifts, in USPA, RPS, in the 48 and 52 kilo classes in both the open and 2 different age groups. She also qualified for the Arnold Classic strict curl competition, even though we didn't go, with only 6 weeks of training. And in the 5 years I have been coaching her, I have never had her deliberately go to the point of muscular failure. Now, will she miss the occasional rep in training? Sure. Especially when we get in the strength cycle and she's working near max. She occasionally miss a rep on a set of 5? Yeah. I tell her to stop if it gets too grindy. That is a consequence of training hard, which she does and y'all don't. But it is never deliberate. Across a typical 13-week training cycle, if she misses 2 to 3 repetitions, that's a lot. Because I don't like to see her miss. I never have her deliberately go to failure. And over the course of a year, she might miss 8 to 12 total repetitions, and it's never deliberate. Now, make no mistake, she had trained for a couple of decades before I started coaching her formally, and she knew how to train hard. She knew how to push herself. If I had started coaching her and she didn't know where her limits were, would I have had her do some training to failure simply to know where it was early on? Yeah, but once she was into her actual training, I don't want her to miss reps. I want her to succeed. I gauge when it's time to add weight, looking at her bar speed, her technical ability. That's what coaching is. But I never, ever deliberately have her go to muscular failure. And I have not in 5 years. Nor will I start at any time in the future or ever with her, because training muscular failure isn't required, and I never said it was. Are we clear on this? Because Mike even said at the very end, Lyle advocates training to failure for all people for all goals, which is a bold-faced lie. And even if he didn't misunderstand me, even if he is truly that unable to understand basic language, I've spelled it out so many times, including here, including my last video. That's not true. Now, if Mike were a man, he would admit his mistake, but he's not. He's an insecure little boy. If Mike has any intellectual honesty, which we all know he doesn't, he would go make a public correction. But he's not going to. He would rather people believe what he says I said rather than correct what I'm actually saying. But that's because Mike and the people that are okay with him lying about me are all of what's wrong with the fitness industry. Are we clear? Nothing I'm going to say in this video is advocating training to muscular failure. Necessarily, again, I'm going to discuss nuances. Is it good or bad? When is it good or bad? There is more to it than absolutist statements by people trying to defend their wimp-ass training. Oh, I was mean. I'm sorry, Mike. You train like a pansy, which is fine. When you're on all the drugs, you can train like that and grow. I'm not advocating training to muscular failure. I have never advocated training to muscular failure without considering the context of when it might or might not be appropriate. And I sure as hell have never advocated it for all people, for all goals, despite Mike's lies. You get it? I am not advocating training to muscular failure. I want to discuss the claims, discuss the research, discuss some of the nuance, and ask some questions. Moving on. So let's start with definitions, because one of the problems in this discussion is that there have and are multiple definitions of failure that are in use. Now, I like to be transparent. I like to be specific up front so that people know exactly what I'm talking about. Others in this field remain deliberately vague so they can change their arguments on the fly. Isn't that right? Now, when I did my original video series, I walked through what physiological muscular failure represents. And I defined it, and will continue to define it as the inability to complete another full-range repetition despite providing maximal effort. Now, you will bring up, but what about technical failure, which is usually defined as being unable to complete another repetition in good form? That is absolutely a valid definition. However, the reality is, in complex movements like a squat or a deadlift, less so the bench, none of you have ever gotten close enough to failure for it to matter. You're not technically stable enough, and let's be honest, you don't have what it takes to take a squat to the point where you descend, get stuck at the bottom, and have to dump the bar no matter how hard you push. I've done it. I'm not recommending it, but I've done it. And I can state with certainty that 99% of you never have. Okay? I know you haven't done it on a deadlift. I have. Am I recommending it? Oh, hell no. But have I done it? Yeah. Reps to failure, where I get stuck in the middle while maintaining perfect form, because I can do it. You can't. If anybody listening to this has done it, it's probably on the bench press. Even then, I doubt it was a technically sound set. You were bouncing the bar off your chest, so you got stuck in the middle and had your idiot training partner help a little and yell, it's all you. All right. I want to do away with technical muscular failure, because that just adds another variable. Let's assume you're on a leg press, where there's no technique to fall apart, or a leg extension, or a hammer chest press. Forget complex barbell exercises. That just confuses the issue. It's one of the ways Mike's confused it. That's why I'm being specific. Focusing on machines, focusing on stable exercises that there really is no form to break. I mean, can it be done? Sure, I've seen people do some ridiculous stuff on chest presses. You know where I'm going with this. So another definition that you will see thrown around is volitional muscular failure, which is generally defined along the lines of the trainee decides that they have done as many as they can do and that they would have reached failure. And that's a joke. And I'll use an extreme example to illustrate that. Let's say that I could truly do 10 repetitions of an exercise. And that would be a limit set. But after 2 repetitions, I've decided that I've failed. That would meet the definition of volitional failure. And I think you can see why that's absurd. Volitional muscular failure is people giving up, which is common because most people have no training drive and no intensity and no focus. But that's not physiological muscular failure. That is an individual trainee's inability to push through discomfort. There is a difference. And some of the other definitions are hilarious. One of the ones Mike came up with did a video on real-world muscular failure, where he said in the real world, failure is stopping 3 reps before true failure. Which, number one, was just him admitting that I was right, that he wasn't anywhere close to actual failure as I had defined it. But B, that's just too metaphysical for me, man. Because 3 reps from true failure is called 3 reps in reserve. And that's fine. Because I was never criticizing Mike's training. And if you want to stop at that level, that's fine. Not that Mike is anywhere close to that either. But to say that 3 reps short of failure is failure, okay, that's nonsense. It may be a valid way to train, but that's not physiological muscular failure. That is Mike making deflections to confuse the people that watches his videos, and nothing more. Again, am going to define physiological muscular failure as the inability to complete another full-range repetition despite providing maximal effort. And the reason I'm using this definition specifically is this. If we're talking about generating a hypertrophy response or even increases in muscular strength, what we are looking at is we need to expose the target muscle to a number of high-tension muscular contractions. And yes, I know there's a metabolic work aspect and metabolites may be involved, although it probably has more to do with recruitment, and I'm aware of that. This is the primary definition. Mechanical tension is and always will be the primary stimulus to growth. The muscle has to experience a sufficient number of high-tension mechanical contractions. That's what turns on protein synthesis. That's a whole separate video. Now, let's say that your quadriceps could do 10 repetitions in the squat before they reach a physiological limit, right? Basically, they can do 10 repetitions of the squat to muscular failure. If your technique falls apart at 5 reps, I don't care that that is technical failure. It is not a training stimulus. Your quads don't care that your technique fell apart muscularly, physiologically. All your muscles know is tension and mechanical work. They don't know that your form fell apart so they can go, oh, well, that was fail. We should still grow. All they know is we didn't experience sufficient tension and mechanical work to get a stimulus and turn on mTOR via the focal adhesion kinase and all that other good stuff. If you decide to stop at 5 repetitions in the squat because you have no training drive, your quads don't care that you decided that was failure. Physiologically, they have not been stimulated. The only relevant definition in a physiological sense when we're talking about the actual stimulus is physiological muscular failure. So if you're on the leg extension machine, you're going rep, 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 and it starts to slow down, which it does, and it slows down, and you hit the middle and can't get it locked out, no matter how hard you try, that is the only definition of physiological muscular failure that I think is relevant. And it's the only one that I'm going to use. So any disagreements with this that are based on any other definition are just people, by which I mean Mike, making a deflection to argue against something I'm not actually saying. This is a logical fallacy called a straw man argument, which Mike and the rest of the fitness gurus love to use. They won't let anybody else get away with it, but they love to use them themselves. All right, now I'm going to blow your mind. Bet that title card confused you, didn't it? Because I'm now going to bring something up that, to my knowledge, no one else in the field has ever mentioned. It was something that my mentor, materials engineer, which meant he actually could think and knew how to do research, introduced me to the concept. So let's say you're doing barbell curls to failure, simply because it's easier for me to demonstrate this, right? You've got the bar, you're doing reps. Now, physiological muscular failure would mean getting stuck in the middle and being unable to complete the repetition, right? As per my previous definition. Let's ask what happens at that point. Let's say I get here And I get here and I know it's not going to go and I immediately put it down? What if I get it to here and try for a couple of seconds and realize it's not going to go and put it down? What if I get here and do the old HIT super slow thing and just push into it for 10 seconds just in case and just grind and grind and grind and then put it down? Maybe after you do that 10-second isometric push, you follow that with a very slow eccentric. Well, guess what? I bet those 4 different things in terms of what you did at failure are going to generate very, very different levels of fatigue. Because what I've just shown is what I'm going to call low, medium, and high volume failure. Low volume failure means you try to get the rep, you know it's not going to go, and you stop after whatever, half a second. Now, maybe you would have ground it out. Maybe you wouldn't have. But once you have practice with this, you're pretty much, you know when it's not going to go. But it takes practice. If you get into it and you really try for 2 or 3 seconds and then know it's not going to go and you put it down, that's medium volume failure. And if you get into it and just go and go and go and, oh, you know, you're 10 seconds and just trying and trying and trying and it doesn't go, that's high volume failure. Those are probably different things. And I can almost guarantee that 0 people watching this video have ever seen that mentioned, read about it, or thought about it. Because those may be very, very, very different things in terms of maybe the stimulus, but maybe the amount of fatigue that's generated. Just something to think about. Nuance. The nuance that nobody but me ever talks about. Moving on. Okay, so what's really the issue here? Well, there's 2. One is the idea that going to failure doesn't generate better growth than not going to failure. And a lot of studies show that's the case. Other studies don't show that's the case. Probably you'd have to really get into them and look at the differences in the training level of the group, how failure is being defined, probably like the total training volume. There's a whole bunch of factors that would play into this. It's not quite as simple as people are making it out to be. So here's the claim, and that is that compared to stopping, say, 1 to 3 reps short of failure, 1 to 3 reps in reserve, that going to muscular failure generates a disproportionate amount of fatigue compared to the increase in stimulus. All right, so let's look at some totally made up math. Let's say that stopping 2 reps in reserve gave you 90 units of hypertrophy stimulus and 90 units of fatigue. But going to muscular failure gave you 95 units of stimulus, but 110 units of fatigue. So only 5 more units of stimulus, but 20 more units of fatigue. It's disproportionate to what you did. These are totally made up numbers, but that's what's being said here, is that the amount of increased stimulus to those extra repetitions is far out of proportion to the increase in the amount of fatigue that's generated. I think that makes sense. That is the claim being made. Now, hilariously, I've seen people go, Mike Israetel has shown this. No, Mike Israetel has asserted this. And there's a difference. And there's an image in the Renaissance periodization book that I've put up here that shows what is being described. Now, I don't actually disagree with this. Quite in fact, in the mid to late 2000s, we were telling the HIT guys the exact same thing. That going to failure, and especially that high volume 10-second isometric to a slow eccentric failure that they tended to promote, was causing excessive amounts of fatigue, causing them to need these massive intervals between their workouts, which was actually hampering their gains. So congratulations to the fitness industry for finally catching up to me 15 years later. It's hilarious that Mike, another one of his personal attacks, said, well, I was just old and out of touch. When only the fitness industry just now is catching up to what I was saying before you'd heard of any of their names. Even funnier is because Mike is he's learned nothing since he started abusing anabolic steroids 10 years ago. Still focusing on the pump, Mike? Dude, 1977 called They Want Their Training Back. Y'all are just now catching up to what I've been saying for over a decade. So congratulations. What was even more funny, and some of y'all will remember this, is a guy named Dr. Doug McGuff. And he came in and he was the new HIT guru. And he told the people, you know, if you only go to muscular failure every other workout, you can train more frequently and you'll grow better. And they did, and they did. which is, again, what we've been telling them for years and they wouldn't listen. Okay, so fundamentally, I don't actually disagree with that statement in a general sense. Well, again, it probably depends on whether you're going to that low, medium, or high volume failure. The HIT guys, the super slow guys, were big on that high volume isometric stuff at the end of every set. That's very different than realizing you're not going to make the rep and putting it down, which is what most people do. And isn't going to, or most likely would not generate that same amount of massive, massive excessive fatigue that those guys were getting. However, I still think saying it in those terms ignores the nuance. And since I want to be the 1% and hopefully get the adoration, or maybe adulation would be a little bit better word, of Kassem, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I want to be the 1% and I will discuss nuance. So again, I don't necessarily disagree with the claim. However, somewhere where this claim is coming from, I think it's valuable to look at the research, which of course I have, and I've read it all, guys. Mike, I'm far more up to date on the research than you are, obviously, and I'm happy to send you some references or papers. Just shoot me an email at admin@bodyrecomposition.com, and I'll get that over to you. So maybe you can get caught up from the mid-2000s training theory that you're still mired in. All right, so let's look at a few of those studies. All right, so let's start by looking real briefly at this is, I think, the most recent meta-analysis on the topic. It's by Grigic, J et al. Effects of resistance training performed a repetition failure or non-failure on muscular strength and hypertrophy, a systematic review and meta-analysis, Journal of Sport, Health, and Sci, 2021, yada, yada. I'm absolutely not going to go through this thing paper by paper by paper because that would, even by my standards, be insane. The reason that I'm mentioning it is because I think what happens is people see papers like this, read, and then stop at the abstract, and let's face it, y'all all do, without really looking at the study designs. So I want to look just real briefly at some of them. So here's a screenshot of like the first 5 or 6 studies that they included in their analysis. All right, so Drinkwater et al. Compared 4 sets of 6 to failure versus 8 sets of 3 repetitions. So twice as many sets, half as many reps. Fisher, 25 repetitions in as few sets as possible to 5 by 5. Fullen, 4 sets of 10 to failure versus 40 repetitions with 30 seconds of rest between repetitions. Yeah, real relevant. Izquierdo, 3 sets of 6 to 10 versus 6 sets of 3 to 5. Karsten, 4 sets of 10 versus 8 sets of 5. So again, half as many repetitions, twice as many sets. And obviously they've got a bunch more papers, but they're all kind of along those lines. And the point I'm trying to make is that they're comparing sets to failure to sets way away from failure. Half as many repetitions, 5 reps in reserve. And even without looking at the details, is anybody surprised that those sets to failure are causing more fatigue? Because yes, 3 sets to failure causes more fatigue than 6 sets of warm-ups. I mean, this isn't news. And I would ask, and I'll come back to this question, when we're talking about hypertrophy training, when we know that 4 reps in reserve is kind of the minimum intensity, and most, including Mike, including Jeff Nippert, including all of the Fit Pros, recommend 1 to 3 reps in reserve, I dare say they are not relevant. So I do want to look at a few specific studies in terms of the details, just because they're very representative of the group, and I think they lead me into my next questions. Now, so people don't think I'm just cherry picking, the papers I'm pulling were referenced in another very recent paper, which you're looking at the reference now. Pelland et al., Methods for Controlling and Reporting Resistance Training Proximity to Failure, Current Issues and Future Directions, SportsMed 2022, March 5th, online ahead of print. Again, Mike, if you want a copy of this so you can get caught up, let me know. I'd mentioned both Eric Helms and Mike Zordos were authors on this paper, and SportsMed, very prestigious journal for whatever that matters. Now, this paper wasn't about failure versus non-failure training per se. It was talking about issues we have defining failure, measuring failure in the lab, in the gym, but it did reference a couple of specific papers on the issue of fatigue. So I'm going to look at the ones that they chose to reference based on the presumption that they picked valid papers. That way you can't accuse me of cherry picking a few papers to support my stance. I'm looking at what they picked. So if you have a problem with these papers, take it up with them. Now, before I continue, one of the things they bring up towards the end They talk about bar speed. They talk about the difficulty in specific trainees knowing how to go to failure. And they present a couple things that I will put up real quickly, because if I'm anything, I'm definitely a petty a-hole. So the image you're looking at here was an example that the paper gave in terms of how bar speed changes as you approach 0 reps from reserve. And you can see that it falls from an average concentric velocity of 0.7 meters per second to 0.31, over a 50% drop. The same thing that I demonstrated in every single video of myself or anybody else that I put up. The same thing that Mike failed to demonstrate when he said he was taking someone to 0 reps from reserve. This is what happens to bar speed as you approach 0 reps from reserve. This is incontrovertible. Every study shows it. If the bar didn't slow, you did not approach or reach 0 reps from reserve. Because in a real-world sense, when you reach physiological muscular failure, the inability to complete a full repetitions despite providing maximal effort, it is because bar velocity or bar speed has fallen too low to actually get you to the sticking point. And that's what this graph shows. It comes again from a tremendous number of authors, including Helms and Zordas. In addition, again, this paper was looking at issues with defining failure, and they state, if using self-reported reps in reserve in research to prescribe training, it is recommended that a set to momentary failure be performed during the pre-testing week to anchor a subject's perception of 0 reps in reserve. The same approach can be applied by practitioners prior to the start of a training program. And what they're clearly saying here is that if you want to have people accurately report or anchor 0 reps in reserve in the lab or in the gym, they need to know what 0 reps reserve and failure are. Does that sound familiar? Because I said in video after video after video, if you have not trained to 0 reps in reserve, or even to true muscular failure, which is the next rep, you don't know where it is. That is a problem with all the research. When you're getting self-reported reps in reserve from minimally trained people that have no clue where it is not a valid measure. You have to do at least one set to true 0 reps in reserve. And you actually go back and look at all the videos I did. That was the majority of what I was saying, which is that A, bar speed drops as you approach 0 reps in reserve, and B, if you've never trained to that point, you don't know what it is, and that you cannot anchor 1 to 3 reps in reserve without knowing that. The other thing I was saying is that what Mike was telling people was 0 reps in reserve wasn't. That's it. Despite how Mike misrepresented it, despite the lies he told about me, despite all the personal attacks, exactly what this paper, including Eric Helms and Mike Zordas, said is what I was saying. Now, they both got PhDs. It was published in a prestigious journal, Eric is a successful bodybuilder and powerlifter. Mike, I believe, is a powerlifter. So you can't just dismiss them out of hand using all of your standard dismissals. If you're going to play the PhD card and keep referring yourself to as doctor and use science to take down Brignol, which is a pretty low bar to cross, then you need to accept this science and accept this paper for what it says. It says the exact same thing I was saying, because I was right. What you claim 0 reps in reserve is when you were training that guy was not. I don't care what you do in your own training. What you said 0 reps in reserve is not. Bar speed never slowed. You don't know where 0 reps in reserve is. He doesn't know where 0 reps in reserve is. 98% of people listening to this don't know what 0 reps in reserve is until you've done at least one set, and trust me, it takes more than that to learn it. You don't know where it is. So I guess you're going to have to go do an hour of character defamation against them now, because you can't rebut the science. You never could. You can dismiss me, but you can't dismiss this paper or them. Or you can show some integrity, go acknowledge that you were wrong, which you're too narcissistic to do, and retract your lies about me, which we both know you're not going to do. Moving on. So that's actually a really good place to wrap this up, and it's right about 30 minutes. In part 2, I'm going to just immediately start with the papers pulled from this Pelland paper that Eric Helms and Mike Zordas were on, to look at the specifics and to see how they do or do not support the claim being made that training to failure causes disproportionate fatigue. And depending on how long that lasts, I might start with a couple of my questions about this data, start looking at the nuance in the context. Haven't edited yet, so I don't know yet. See you there.